How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylai Hobby Time. The weather here in Denver just got cold. We had our first snow way later than usual, and the drop in temperature prompted me to build something that I've had in my head for a while now. The concept here is ice fishing, but in the wild imaginary West. And obviously I could have gone with something strange and unusual beneath the ice, but I decided to go with something a little more familiar, and that would be a fish. But not just any fish, a gigantic northern pike. If I'm being completely honest with myself, I probably have to admit that I chose a fish because it's a pretty low-hanging fruit on the sculpting tree. A lower-hanging fruit would have been like a worm or a snake, but those wouldn't have made as much sense in a frozen body of water. I broke out my Super Sculpey and started comparing the volume of what would become the fish to the size of this 1/72 scale miner. While this first lump would definitely be a record-sized northern pike, I felt like I needed to keep making it bigger and bigger. I began roughly sculpting and elongating that lump of clay into the general shape of a pike, and then I broke out some sculpting tools to give the thing some gills and other details, like a mouth, which turned out to be a lot more smiley than I had intended. Given the fact that the shape of the head and the details on the head, the aggressive appearance, is what makes a pike look like a pike, I probably should have spent a little bit more time making this thing look angry. After hollowing out those eye sockets, I imprinted some mesh over top to give it some scales, and then I threw all the fins in place. And this goofy SpongeBob side character fish was ready to be baked in the oven. At this point, the fish was not looking as realistic as I had hoped it would. We could chalk that up to my sculpting skills, or lack thereof. But maybe we can make up for what it lacks in realism in the sculpt with a better paint job. After the clay had been baked in the oven, I put it on a painting handle, and I started applying some paint. I loaded up my airbrush with an acrylic black primer, and gave that a nice full coat. Once the fish had been fully primed and dried using a hairdryer, I swapped out the primer in the airbrush for an off-white, which I applied to the underbelly of the fish. After that, I moved to the top and began applying some color. Growing up, I went fishing fairly often. I grew up in Mongolia, and I'm not sure how it is now, but back then, fishing was outstanding. We caught many fish, including northern pike. They have a nice fight to them, but they will cut your line because of their sharp teeth unless you have a steel leader. One fish that I never caught, though, that I always wanted to, which was very unique to that part of the world, was the taimen. Many fishermen have now heard of the legendary Hucho taimen, but if you haven't heard of it before, it's a relative of a trout or salmon, but on average it's the largest member of the salmonid family. The largest unofficially recorded taimen ever caught, supposedly, was 83 inches and 231 pounds. As monstrous as taimen are, they're nowhere near as monstrous as this pike. This thing is like the size of a whale shark. After applying a glossy clear coat, it was time to make the river. To do that, I'll be using some pink XPS foam. First thing I had to do was to cut out the large sections that will make up the exterior walls of the diorama. I grabbed a piece of foam that was the right width and I cut that to length 5 times. With all my rectangles cut, I could then glue them together into one solid rectangular cube. Is that what you would call a rectangular cube? Is there another word for that? A block, there we go. And I glued that together using some foam safe super glue. The sheets weren't perfectly aligned when I glued them together, so to get some nice uniform sides, I cut them all together on my hot wire table. Once I had a nice even block, cut out the cross section of my little channel of water. And everything was going great. Until it wasn't. I made that sound way more dramatic than it actually is. All I did was snap the wire on my hot wire table, which takes a couple minutes to fix, but no worries. Thank you all for your patience. With the hot wire table back in business, I could complete the rest of my slicing. That was the last I needed the hot wire table for, so I put that away and I could start working on the texture. And I broke out a good old classic mix, which I haven't worked with in a while. And that would be plaster, paint, and Mod Podge. These days, in most instances where I want the ground to have some nice organic texture, I go with Sculpting. But in this case, it's either going to be covered by snow if it's above ground, or I want it to be smooth because it's going to be under the water. So that's why I went with this terrain mix. While the terrain paste was still wet, I sprinkled on some rocks and pebbles and sand, and then I accelerated the dry time just a little bit by using a hairdryer, which, if it was just the plaster, would cause it to crack, but because it has the paint and the Mod Podge in there, it's a little bit more flexible, and you don't run the risk of it cracking as easily. Finally, I glued some sunken logs and greenery at the bottom. We'll let that dry fully without the hairdryer overnight. And in the meantime, we can take care of a few other things, including a little standoff for the fish, which will hopefully disappear once I pour the resin. I squeezed some UV resin into a translucent plastic straw, which will allow UV light through. Wasn't sure how it was going to work, but after a couple attempts, I came up with something that was bubble-free and almost completely clear. I'm pretty happy about this process and will definitely use it more in the future. I glued that to the underside of the fish, and I embedded a little slot to hold the fish later on. I will not do that quite yet. And I left that to dry overnight and came back the next day with the airbrush because it was time to prime again. After the whole thing had been given a coat of black, I loaded up the airbrush with a brown base coat. And it's hard to tint the resin to be different colors at different depths, but a way to make it look like the color of the resin changes is to just paint the colors on the side of whatever you're pouring the resin into. So just paint the landscape itself. So in this case, I painted a subtle river water gradient going down to a nice, like dark bluish kind of color. And then I followed that up with a frosty blue to give everything a little bit more chilly of an appearance. At this point, all of this acrylic paint would bleed off into the resin. So in order to prevent that, I took this outside and gave everything a coat of clear varnish. When the varnish layer was fully dry, I glued the fish in place, and it was time to create the acrylic dam. As you can see, I've used this acrylic before. Don't remember for what, but the other side still had the peel on it, which meant it was basically as good as new. I forgot to stock up on silicone adhesive, but I think I have finally figured out how to use hot glue safely on resin pours. As long as you don't rely on that first pass of hot glue to both hold the acrylic and be the sealer, you should be good to go. Then you can go around the rest of the areas that have potential leakage, patch those up with the hot glue, or in this case, masking tape, and yeah, you should be good to go. But even as I'm saying that, should be good, doesn't really go very far with resin. So always be prepared for the worst. Realistically, a fishing line would not be visible at this scale. As you can see, I did add a fishing line because, I guess for storytelling reasons, it's better if you can see it. I broke out my 2-part slow curing epoxy resin and mixed that up at the recommended 2-to-1 ratio. Actually, I guess that's not a recommendation, unless you want to absolutely ruin your resin. I tinted the resin with just a small bit of blue and green, and some air was introduced during the mixing stage, which needed to be removed via a vacuum pot. Once that had been placed inside, I flipped it on, and now we can watch as the pressure drops inside the pot and the bubbles all rise to the surface and dissipate. After the pressure in the pot had equalized once again, all of the remaining bubbles pretty much disappeared entirely. With that done, it was time to pout. Sorry, I misspelled pour in my voiceover script, and I just read it like that. What I meant was, it was time to pour. The resin needs to sit for a few days to cure, so in the meantime, let's paint some fishermen. You may be looking at these fishermen thinking, hey, those are miners, not fishermen. But luckily for us, ice fishing and mining share a lot of the same poses, like crouching, looking down, straining, trying to find something really large in the water. And at 1:72 scale, with just a little bit of snipping and gluing, it will be very hard to tell the difference. And a simple trick to remember, if you ever get something stuck to your finger, is to just freak out until it comes off. For this standing guy, I swapped out his pickaxe for a fishing rod. And I know that ice fishing rods are really tiny, but he was in too perfect of a position to not be holding a full-size rod. With the customizations done, it was time to start painting. I threw them on some painting handles, and I actually started with a clear coat of matte varnish to act as a primer for the primer. This orange plastic that these guys are made of has historically given me a lot of trouble holding paint. After the black primer, I followed that up with a light gray zenithal highlight, and I've found that painting these little minis with contrast or speed paints is probably my favorite approach to base coats, at least at this scale. Aside from the whale-sized northern pike and the full-sized fishing rod, one more thing to add to the list of goofy is the fact that none of these guys are wearing winter clothing. Probably could, or should have, used green stuff to give them a little extra padding. Another thing I could have done to make them look a little bit warmer is to not paint them in such bright colors. Usually winter wear is not, unless you're on a ski hill, is not very bright. So in order to communicate heavier fabric, I probably could have gone with more neutral colors than what I chose. Either way, after blocking in all those base colors with the contrast paints, I followed that up with the highlights and some other details like gloves, which did a little bit to help make them look a little warmer. With that, the painting of the miniatures was done, and I was happy with the level of detail I was able to put on these things. Then it was time to move back to the resin. That first round of resin turned out pretty much perfectly, and before removing the acrylic dam, I of course needed to add some ice. This layer was only going to be about 1/4 of an inch thick, so I went with a faster curing resin and very scientifically dosed out equal parts of resin and hardener. And I don't know why I continued with this resin, because the hardener had yellowed and the resin itself was crystallized and took forever to get out of the bottle. For some reason I pressed on. And because this layer is going to be ice, I added some opaque white to the same bluish green that I made before. And I don't know what is in that white pigment, but it is incredibly potent. And the warning labels would suggest that it is not very healthy. I threw part A and part B in a larger mixing container, and because of the thickness of the resin, it got insanely cloudy with microbubbles. It's legitimately like making meringues. And when I threw it in the vacuum pot, which I didn't record, it actually made it worse. But that's okay, we're pressing on. Rather than attempting to drill a hole in the ice after the fact, I decided to make a little collar that would hold back the resin and make the hole in the ice for me. Once the collar had been slipped around the fishing line and sealed in place with more UV resin, it was time to pour those cloudy egg whites. In general, my advice to you if you're making a project like this and you feel like the next thing you add is going to potentially ruin your project, probably stop. But I didn't do that this time. I'm generally probably more optimistic about outcomes than I should be. But it paid off in this one because I think the ice turned out really nice. One added benefit of hot glue is that isopropyl alcohol causes it to lose its grip on reality, and it forgets that it's supposed to be sticky and slides right off. In this situation though, the resin itself had a very tight grasp on the acrylic, so I needed to use a heat gun in order to prompt its release. As you can see here, the acrylic removal made the foam look like garbage, but we can solve that problem in a minute. One of the key ingredients for making this ice look convincing is to add little hairline cracks on the surface. For that I used my X-Acto. I also used the X-Acto to clean up the flashing on the corners of the resin, as well as clean up the little edges around the hole. I guess it's just one edge because it is a circle. At this point I was really happy with the way the ice was looking, but the sides of the diorama were still pretty nasty, so I cleaned those up with some wooden veneer. After some trimming and sanding of those corners, the sides of my diorama were nice and clean, and they were ready for a coat of black 3.0. I began applying that with a brush, and then I switched to a sponge because that leads to a much more consistent application. After the sides had been painted black, I broke out some snow powder from Woodland Scenics and I mixed it with Mod Podge to create a nice spreadable snow paste, which unfortunately looks very, very appetizing. Almost like a homemade ice cream or something. I applied that to both of the shores and I used it to hide the top cut edge of the veneer that I did not paint with black 3.0. Finally, I sprinkled some loose snow powder over the top, which I blew around just like real snow. I sealed that with watered down white glue and isopropyl alcohol, and then it was time to glue the fisherman in place. After our 3 underdressed fishermen were in position, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.